The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hello everyone out there. Today is March 27th, 2015. I am Jeff Peters, the HackSurfer editor. I'm here with Matt Leifus, HackSurfer writer, and Michael Fell, Surfwatch Labs data analyst. A little bit later after the discussion, we have an interview with Kevin O'Brien. We've talked to him a few times, and he's worked at different companies, but he's at a new startup now called GreatHorn. And we chat about the first quarter of 2015 and just kind of what stands out to him so far this year. Diving right into it, we can throw it over to Matt for some of the top cyber headlines of the week.
Coming in at number 3 this week, we had a government website for the state of Maine. They've been attacked 3 days in a row with a DDoS attack. We're seeing evidence that a group calling themselves Vikingdom 2015, it seems that they've claimed credit for the attack. We've seen a lot of tweets from them on the topic, and they've also given some reference to other people as well. Number 2, we have Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. Police identified a credit card breach at the Tom Bradley International Terminal this week at LAX. At this time, the vendor wasn't named. We're not sure who was actually affected in the breach. It just made news that there was a credit card breach at this terminal for LAX. So I'm sure down the future there'll be more information on that. And the number 1 target this week was greatfire.org. This is an activist group that is fighting to end China's censorship on the internet. This week, they were hit with their first ever DDoS attack. So we've been talking about DDoS a lot this week. There's speculation that China itself is behind the attack after a Wall Street Journal article came out that detailed how this group was using cloud-based services to poke holes through China's internet censorship. So maybe a little retaliation from China on their part. So I'll kick it to you, Jeff. What are we going to discuss this week?
I thought that GreatFire story was pretty interesting just because they were asking for help because their Amazon bandwidth costs jumped all the way up to $30,000 a day. So obviously that's pretty pricey. So I just think a lot of times, DDoS stories you hear and people are kind of quick to dismiss them as though it's not that important, but that kind of, really helped drive home the financial aspect of DDoS. Another DDoS thing that kind of popped up is actually a little bit of an older story, but from the beginning of March, Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony are kind of teaming up to try to defend against these DDoS attacks against the gaming industry. I'm just kind of working on a gaming article now, so I've been reading up on it a little bit, and I was talking with Encapsula, and they were just talking about how even though it's a good thing, it could potentially make him even a bigger target, just because obviously hackers or hacktivists, might be motivated by that challenge of kind of trying to bring down all 3 gaming networks at once. Yeah, so there's been a lot of kind of gaming related news so far this year. Just this week, Twitch, which is the Amazon-owned video streaming service, reset the passwords for all of its users after warning that a security breach may have allowed hackers to access usernames, passwords, and other personal information. There isn't a whole lot of details about the attack, and they say that they may have gained unauthorized access. They don't necessarily say exactly what happened yet, so I assume, in the coming weeks we'll get more details on what happened at Twitch.
One of my big predictions for this year is that you're going to see a lot more malware and hacker discussion regarding the gaming industry, just because it's grown so much. Just to put that into perspective, there's the whole idea of esports, which are like professional gaming associations, and they've kind of blown up in the last couple of years. Criminals have been developing malware that targets gaming, tools and software and things along those lines that will steal like passwords or items that you can win or purchase off of these certain gaming websites like Steam or Origin. So I would expect more malware, more denial of service attacks in the gaming industry, given that it's such a global phenomenon.
Yeah, not to mention, I mean, I think was it just last week we were talking about, some of these, there was a Tesla crypt ransomware attacks too in the gaming industry. So yeah, you're right, Mike, they have definitely become a big target, and they are being targeted in multiple ways.
I would highly recommend watching Vice's 5-part mini documentary on esports, and this will put a lot of what we're saying kind of in perspective. The industry in South Korea and Europe, the esports gaming culture is really blown up. It hasn't really taken off here in the United States quite yet, but it's inevitably going to come. So we'll see more attacks along malware, denial of service attacks just in the gaming industry in the next couple of this year or within the next couple of months, just given the scope of how big it is and how much money's going around it, how every little piece in information is now becoming commoditized by cyber criminals.
There was another interesting story this week about the Poseidon malware. Researchers from Cisco discovered this new point-of-sales malware. And the malware scrapes the memory of infected machines for payment card information and exfiltrates that data to servers, many of which are hosted on Russian domains. And earlier this year, there was 2 other point-of-sale malware families, the Pawn POS and Log POS, that were discovered. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago on the podcast too, just the point-of-sale attacks kind of coming back into the news. And this week we got another one at LAX. Those point-of-sale breaches were kind of falling off the radar so far this year, but now, the past couple of weeks we've seen quite a few different ones.
I feel that the POS malware is evolving in the sense that as a cybersecurity companies address the vulnerabilities, the criminals always change. So it's this ever-evolving issue that I think will continue to be in the news for some time.
Well, when I look at, anything point of sales, I mean, as we all know, we have a chip and pin rolling out here in October. So I'll be kind of curious to see what's going to happen in the near future. I mean, are cyber criminals going to take the time to keep evolving these attacks, considering, in my opinion, what's definitely going to drastically mitigate some of these point-of-sale breaches when chip and pin come out? I guess I'm just curious to see, in the short term up until October, how many more of these attacks we're going to see.
I'm not really quite sure. I could see malware evolving to address the chip and pin precautions. I could also see a major uptick in the amount of POS malware before everything switches to chip and pin, just so people can siphon as many credit cards off as quickly as possible before the changeover. It's really hard to say. I think there's some healthy skepticism about chip and pin. I'm the type of person who always I believe that as technology evolves, there's always going to be criminals who are going to be able to get around any sort of security measures. So, I mean, it's a wait-and-see game at this point.
And when we interviewed Cyan Gonan from Gemalto on the podcast about a month ago about the report that they put out, one of the things that he said was they saw for the first time, I forget the exact percentage, but basically identity-based kind of breaches were like the most prevalent, and he was kind of tying that to the fact that the banks are becoming a lot more proactive. I believe he said, his bank called him and canceled his card like 5 or 6 different times that year. So the banks are becoming much more proactive about fighting this theft. So the window for using a stolen credit card, and I think that was kind of the case with Target. They stole so many, but then by the time you look at the actual number that was sold and that they made money off of, it was actually relatively small. So
yeah, and that's why these guys, when they steal these credit cards, it's their first thing is when they confirm that they have the credit cards is to put them up on dark markets as soon as possible and sell as many of them as possible.
Another big story that popped up this week is ISIS. They posted the names, photos, and home addresses of 100 American troops, urging sympathizers inside the U.S. to carry out attacks against them. I assume that most of the information they got, they just doxed them and got it from social media and other places. So, on one hand, I feel like, it's really not that big of a story, but I was reading this story from First Coast News just this morning, and, it has one of the wives of one of the soldiers. She's just talking about how scared she is and scared for her children's lives, and She says, as I told the FBI, these people have no problem slicing children's throats, and the report states that they want to stab to death. So at one hand, it's pretty easy to dismiss it as, oh, it's just a bunch of idiots, just kind of throwing threats out there. But on the other hand, if you're one of those people who actually are targeted by these doxing attacks, it can be kind of psychologically, nerve-wracking.
And I think that was their main purpose, is to strike fear into people. That's just what they're going to do. You can debate how terrorism is defined, but one major part of that is fear. And that's just what they're trying to do with this. And it wasn't anything fancy. They at first claimed that they compromised some U.S. military servers or something along those lines, but some folks did a little digging around, and it was just a simple dox. So, I mean, one takeaway from this is about social media security, and changing those settings, making sure you're non-searchable, being mindful of what you post on social media. That's one of the major takeaways from this.
So with this here, I mean, concerning ISIS, and Jeff, I think we talked about this, maybe it was this week or maybe it was before, you typed up a snippet and you used the word seemingly random attacks that this group seems to be carrying out as it pertains to like cyber attacks. With this here, we clearly see what they're trying to do, but a lot of the other things that ISIS has been doing, they've kind of been all over the place recently, haven't they? Like just attacking random targets. And
there are several groups that are sympathetic, but I'm assuming aren't necessarily tied to IS, the Islamic State. I did read one story where the claim was 600 Russian websites were defaced by a group or groups associated with ISIS, which, I mean, a defacement isn't any sort of big deal. It's somebody painting graffiti and then you just have to clean it up. But one can make the argument that their cyber capabilities, in quotation marks, are advancing. I'm a little skeptical because it's just, I think just by reading the news, IS is kind of on their heels. Given the offensives in Iraq and what's happening in Syria, they have more important things to worry about. And they mainly use the internet as an information operations tool, not sort of a offensive cyber attacking sort of tool. So a lot of people have been talking up their capabilities. I'm a little more skeptical, given that it's probably in their best interest to use the internet to spread their information and not attack people.
And from what I read, I think most of the attacks, at least a couple weeks ago when I read this, said a lot of the defacements were tied to a certain WordPress vulnerability, I believe.
Exactly.
So yeah, basically they're just scanning the web for whatever site's vulnerable, whether it's I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago. There was breweries, credit unions, little churches, just kind of all these random sites, really all over the world.
Yeah, it's the lowest hanging fruit concept. They're going to use a vulnerability that has already been disclosed, but people may have not updated their sites. They're going to exploit the vulnerability and do what they do.
All right, well, moving on, we have our cyber tip of the week. Earlier this week, Secunia released their annual vulnerability report, and some of the numbers from there were kind of interesting to me. In 2014, there were 15,435 vulnerabilities discovered across 3,870 applications. So that's an 18% increase in the number of total vulnerabilities from 2013 and a 55% increase over the past 5 years. So obviously, as more applications and, more stuff happens on the tech front, there's going to be more vulnerabilities. But one interesting thing, they had a whole section in the report on sort of the OpenSSL and, like Heartbleed and all those different things that happened in 2014. And it seemed to be, they had a chart in there, it was just kind of random in terms of when these different vendors were notifying their customers of these vulnerabilities. And so Casper Lindgaard, he's the director of research and security at Secunia. He told me when I interviewed him, he said, it's very hard as an end customer that has products from a lot of different vendors to actually know if their products are vulnerable and what type of third-party applications or third-party libraries the products they bought actually use. He pointed out, and also the report pointed out, that you want to definitely not rely on those vendors, but you really need to know yourself, what kind of libraries are in the products and keep an eye on those things so that when these vulnerabilities do come out, you can get on them right away. Because even some of the major vendors were pretty slow in alerting their customers that some of their applications were vulnerable. Coming up, we have our interview with Kevin O'Brien, who's part of the startup GreatHorn, and what they do is they automate risk identification to help protect against data breaches. And we chat about some of the stuff that's happened so far in 2015. Being almost the end of the first quarter 2015, I'm just curious if there's any trends or kind of things that stand out in your mind so far this year?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you take a look at the ISF report that came out, the Threat Horizons 2017 piece they put out in early March, they called out a couple of things that I've seen replicated in other conversations and other places. Namely, that we're seeing an increased focus on insider threats, that some of the big data breaches that have come out this year are starting to draw more attention to the healthcare industry, and that there's an increasing number of folks on the attack side who are starting to co-opt some of the techniques and technologies and methods that we've traditionally seen inside of organizational InfoSec teams. Things like establishing centers of excellence and working collaboratively, but they're doing all of this with the interest of getting access to sensitive data and corporate networks versus what we might have seen 5 years ago, where it seemed like it was a group of guys working in basements in isolation.
I guess one of the big stories that have really stood out to me have been, insurance related. Obviously, we had Anthem, which could very well be the biggest breach we see this year with, 80 million people. But also there was Premera, Advantage Dental, a couple others that have come out the last week. Wondering if there's any conclusions we can draw from that. Is insurance suddenly a bigger target, or is that just kind of the next companies in the crossfire?
I think it's useful to look at the insurance breaches both from a how perspective and a why perspective. The how perspective is that the insurance industry has traditionally lagged behind some of the other sectors that we've seen breaches in over the last few years. So if you look at the financial services teams that have responded to some of the breaches that have happened at places like JPMC, or you look at the retail space, vis-a-vis Target and Home Depot, these guys all had pretty sophisticated networks, and a lot of the penetrations that occurred there were surprising because they came in through vectors we hadn't expected before. Things like the HVAC guys being used to gain privilege escalation rights. Insurance is in many ways a little bit behind the times, especially healthcare insurance, because these guys are responding to regulatory oversight that they haven't had a lot of runway to deal with. HIPAA, high tech, the rise of EMR systems. There's a whole new threat landscape out there. And for many of these organizations, especially the ones in primary care, they're running close to the margins, and it's very hard sometimes to justify spend. The other is the why, and there is just a tremendous value to the kind of personally identifiable information that comes out of healthcare information and insurance information. You can find home addresses, you can find physical descriptions, you can find name changes. You obviously have medical information, but it's enough to build a really complete picture. And that's the kind of data that goes for high value on the black market. And it's some of the most expensive data you can buy if you're looking to buy black market information for identity theft.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's, maybe any other sectors that stand out to you as vulnerable like that. For example, I was looking at some of our data, and like universities, there's been a lot of incidents at universities so far this year. And so obviously, banking and retail, they get a lot of attention, but like you were saying, healthcare is a little behind the times, maybe insurance is a little behind the times. Are there other kind of sectors like that maybe stand out to you, or you think we might see more activity?
Yeah, so, I want to make a clarifying point. We talk about being behind the times, but these are areas where the technological innovation has been world-class. It just hasn't been on the security front, and it's that there's a lot of change. And I think that's the way that we look at other industries that are potentially going to be vulnerable. What creates threat surfaces that don't have adequate oversight is rapid pace of development and rapid pace of innovation. We're seeing this starting to emerge in technology companies. So if you look at the RSA conference that happens in April, which is about a month from this recording, there's a focus on the DevOps movement and how it is starting to influence and change where technology gets deployed inside both Fortune 500 companies, but also startups. I think we're going to see that is another mechanism of risk for a lot of data, because these are the types of things where you either have people who don't have traditional security backgrounds making decisions that impact data sensitivity, or you just see rapid development, and often that's happening at the expense of good governance and good oversight. And you can't stop it. The train's underway. We have to find a way to get the security guys onto that journey rather than trying to stand in front of it.
Yeah, and you brought up RSA, and I know last time we've talked, I think it was last time, we've spoken quite a few times, but I think at last RSA you were talking about how, on the cloud front there was a lot of debate or chatter about, are you going to empower the users, or are you going to try to lock everything down? So just wondering, kind of heading into this RSA, if there's any sort of other new debates kind of happening, or if it's still the same ones that have been happening the last couple of years, kind of in the cybersecurity community.
Yeah, so the conversation about whether security would be an enabling layer inside of the modern organization or it would be a blocking layer is largely resolved. I mean, there are holdouts and there always will be, but I think we are no longer in an era where it's even sensible to have a conversation about whether or not someone's going to be able to get access to the devices they need, the applications they need, the environments they need to do their jobs. So really the locus of discussion has changed to one of what is it that we're going to do as information security professionals to respond to that. And the sobering realization, and the one that I think is going to permeate RSA this year, is that InfoSec, traditionally responsible for being gatekeepers, are now being asked to respond to existing infrastructure, existing landscapes. So I think there's going to be a big focus on visibility. I think there's going to be a number of good threads and conversations that arise in the speaking sessions about how you get more visibility into what's going on in your environment and how you respond to it. I know that some of the folks in my network are speaking about something I've just mentioned, the DevOps movement, and how that's going to dovetail with security. These are all about emerging landscapes and emerging threats. And I think it's clear, if you look over the last couple of years, we haven't yet cracked the code. There are still breaches coming out regularly. The thing that starts with Target a couple years ago, year and a half ago, is still proceeding. And so there's this big focus right now on, okay, if it's not enough to say we're going to empower our users, we also have to have visibility into what they're doing. How do we marry those two worlds?
Yeah, another thing that's gotten a lot of coverage so far in 2015 has just been the government sort of getting involved. Obama's talking about it in the State of the Union. There's, I believe it was on Tuesday, there was another bill proposed in Congress dealing with cybersecurity. Just wondering your thoughts in general. There's been a bit of debate on both sides about whether that's a good or a bad thing.
Yeah, so I remember sitting at the Gartner Symposium 2 years ago in Barcelona and listening to their 2020 projections. And one of the projections that the analysts put forth was that we would see an increasing level of governance from the government and from organizational levels on down, there being this mandate to push data back out to federal resources. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're starting to see that the Gartner guys know what they're talking about, and there is a potential future in which we are all passing our information to organizations like the Department of Homeland Security. Now, what we're seeing today is a very early set of steps towards what I think is a positive. How do we start thinking about cybersecurity sharing of information? How do we mitigate risk and get a little further down the path in that way?
There's been a couple other big stories this year. There was the Uber breach, been getting a lot of attention. There's the Freak encryption vulnerability. Just wondering, if just kind of looking at these last couple of months, if anything else really stands out in your mind?
Yeah, so, I think Freak and I think Heartbleed before it, I think some of the focus that we're seeing on vulnerabilities, it's important to note that what we're seeing now are zero-day exploits and major system-level exploits that are crossing over from single organizational artisanal APT attacks. and they're becoming more widespread. What do I mean by that? Go look at the Mandiant report that came out and the APT1 report, and you see this rise in focus on APT inside the information security industry. APT, advanced persistent threat, the kinds of things that are highly targeted, adaptive, focus on penetrating single organizational networks. There's certainly still some of that happening. If you look at what happened at Sony, it's pretty clear that that was an example of a dedicated attack against one organization. But what I think you can draw a conclusion from looking at things like the Freak and Heartbleed and other vulnerabilities is that there's also systemic weakness. There are things that are occurring that we're finding out about because they are happening at an infrastructure layer or they're pervading the tools that everybody uses. And so figuring out how that's happening, spending more time looking for indications of risk and breach is one of the defense techniques we're now starting to see a number of companies think about, develop, focus on, both inside InfoSec security operations centers and from the vendor community.
Yeah, another thing I wanted to get your opinion on is just, I guess with me, reading all these cybersecurity stories every day and covering cybersecurity news, sometimes I almost feel like I'm in a little bubble, and then you talk to your friends or your family and, they don't really know what's going on, or maybe they don't care what's going on. So I'm just curious, like when you look at like small businesses and medium businesses and, even enterprises out there, like, are you seeing improvements on that front of just people becoming more aware, or do you still think there's sort of this little cybersecurity bubble and then there's sort of everybody else?
Yeah, I can't remember a time when there's been so much focus on cybersecurity, excepting perhaps the late 90s. So I definitely think that we're seeing increased attention. But I think you have a point, which is that we also are professionals who are trained in and paid to pay attention to this space. I am seeing more interest from the mid-market. I am seeing that, for example, my company's working with an HMO here in Massachusetts. There's an understanding that they need to do more than just tick regulatory boxes, which would have been sufficient 10 years ago. But now they need to have a comprehensive InfoSec program. They have to be thinking about visibility and monitoring and quick response times. So things are getting better. Dan Gear, a guy that I know from my At Stake days and a luminary in many ways in the InfoSec space, says that the only time it's really going to turn around is when there's been enough pain. And pain is really proxied in this industry by financial loss. We've seen a lot of that. Hopefully it's been enough, but I think it still has some ways to go before it becomes truly ubiquitous.
Before we wrap up, I know that you just recently started a new company and are raising some funding for that. So I was maybe wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it is you're doing and what GreatHorn's all about.
Yeah, of course. So GreatHorn is born out of many of these observations. I think that there is a fundamental disparity between how information security professionals work with their data inside of their siloed organizations to try to respond to risks, and how these consortiums of criminals and hackers are working together to find ways to penetrate those networks. Our premise is pretty simple. We are collecting information, telemetry data, security, incident reports from all of our customers. We're running it through a machine learning loop on our side and then pushing back out predictive analytics via a dashboard to our space. The idea is that if you're one of these information security professionals that's sitting in a SOC somewhere with 150,000 alerts on a daily basis, we can help you figure out which ones are the most important to go look at first, and we can also help you simplify the regulatory side of your job so you can spend more time on really effective security. And as you said, we're fairly early days. We're raising our seed round now, and we're looking to come to market later this year.
Yeah, that's pretty much all the questions I have, unless there's anything else you wanted to touch on before we left.
No, I always enjoy these, Jeff, and I'm certainly happy to continue the conversation, and we'll see where things stand in 6 months.
Thanks for listening to this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. As always, make sure to follow us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen. And if you want more information, check out HackSurfer.com and SurfWatchLabs.com.